In our last video, we discussed some common misconceptions about acute and long-term stress and anxiety that students may experience during the COVID-19 pandemic. In this video, we will dive deeper into understanding how anxiety might impact you. Stress and anxiety can impact different people in many different ways. This will hopefully help you to recognize when you are experiencing anxiety and understand how anxiety may impact you and others, as well as how anxiety might change over time.
So there are all types of impact of how anxiety makes us feel, from giving headaches to nausea to muscle pain, fatigue, trouble sleeping, irritability. And it's not to say that it will affect everybody in all of these ways, but it's a matter of learning, how does anxiety affect me? When I know that I'm anxious, when I know that I'm stressed, what am I feeling? Are my muscles tight? Do I feel it in my back? Do I feel it in my legs? Do I feel especially nauseous? Are my shoulders up near my ears? And so you start to learn, hey, what happens to me when I'm anxious? And then when you feel those things, when you notice, oh, wait, my shoulders are really high, or my shoulders hurt, or I feel really sick, maybe that's a sign that I'm anxious. And so if that happens on a test, you start to say, gee, maybe I'm feeling anxious, and that's why I'm having trouble on the test. Maybe it has nothing to do with whether I know the material. And so in addition to the physical effects, there are some really common cognitive effects of feeling anxious. We sometimes feel like our mind's going blank, especially on a test. If you become really anxious, you might start to feel like, I just can't think of the answer. Or if you're anxious in giving a presentation, you might start to forget what you wanted to say. And it's not because you didn't prepare, and it's not because you just don't know, but it's that feeling anxious. And that sense of anxiety kind of can get in the way and make it hard to think of what you wanted to say. Sometimes people have difficulty focusing. They might focus on the things making them anxious, and so they're having more trouble focusing on an exam, or they're having more trouble focusing on something they're doing. And that's not because you're not paying attention, or you're not working hard enough, or you can't just push your way through it. You acknowledge that, well, I'm anxious, and I'm going to let it pass, and then I'll be able to focus more, and I'll get done what I can right now while I wait. Sometimes our thoughts become catastrophic. They start small. They start with something that maybe seems somewhat reasonable, and then it becomes a little bit worse, like, well, I'm going to miss this question on a test. Becomes, well, I think I'm going to fail this test. I think I'm going to fail the class. I'm going to fail out of school, and it will snowball. Because each little step, we become a little more anxious. Well, I'm going to miss this question. Okay, now I'm a little anxious about missing the question. Well, now I start to think, gee, well, if I miss this, then maybe I'll fail the test. Well, now I become really anxious that I'm going to fail the test. Well, gee, that means maybe I might fail the class. And so it snowballs from there. And all of this is worsened by these kinds of thinking traps that just happen when we're anxious. These are normal, and they happen from a lot of people, not everybody, but for most. We might overestimate the threat. We might start to think, gee, giving a speech in front of people, they're going to think that I'm really silly. And so we start to think, it's really likely that they think I'm really silly. I might really embarrass myself. It might be really likely that I embarrass myself. And we start to overestimate how likely that is. We might overgeneralize. So if you're having trouble on one class, it might start to feel as though you're going to have trouble with other classes. Having trouble with one question on an exam might kind of generalize to think, well, gee, if I don't know this, then maybe I'm going to have trouble with other things. But often it's the result of being anxious. You're not really having trouble. And then sometimes there becomes this negative filter. So in addition to overestimating how likely it is that something bad will happen, we may pay attention to the bad things that happen. We may kind of filter out or pay less attention to the things that would be what we call safety cues, that tell us that this is okay, that this is safe, that there's not a threat, that this will go well. because we're worried that it won't. So we're paying attention to the things that confirm or help us identify that it's not going to go well. And all of that becomes a kind of cycle of anxiety where you become a little bit anxious. And so you focus on the things that or that just leads you to focus on the things that confirm your anxiety, that lead to overestimating the likelihood that something bad will happen, to focusing on anything bad that happens, which generalizes the idea that something bad will happen. And it becomes a very vicious cycle. Here's what we know about anxiety, and my group has studied this for some time. It doesn't necessarily last very long. And often, the faster it goes up, the higher it goes, the faster it comes back down. So when you get really anxious on a test, or you get really anxious trying to do an assignment, that usually means it's going to go back down just as quickly, maybe a little bit longer. But that's why we recommend that people give it that time, that they take a little bit of time and let the anxiety come back down. So if you're working on an exam and you find that I'm really, really anxious on this question, that's part of why we say just leave the question. Just skip that question and go on to something that's easier. Do something, find things you can do while you wait for the anxiety to come back down, because it will. One of the things we find is that anxiety starts to go up, then people start to overestimate the likelihood that something bad will happen, or they filter out positive or safe things that could happen, kind of cues that they're okay. And so that leads to even more anxiety, and then that leads to even more. And so it cycles like that. If you can identify that, hey, I'm anxious, and I'm okay with that, and I'm just going to let that be for a few minutes. If it doesn't cycle, then it comes back down. We've also seen a lot of depression. In our research on families in Windsor, Essex, we've asked a lot of kids and a lot of parents, hey, how are you doing? How is your kid doing? And they say, wow, I'm much more anxious. They also say, I'm feeling really irritable. And they describe feeling kind of depressed, like sad, having a loss of interest in things they used to enjoy, feeling like maybe they're eating more or they're eating less than they used to. They're sleeping more, or sleeping less, or they're having trouble falling asleep. And they may feel really energized, really agitated, or really, really tired. And sometimes people feel worthless, or they think they're guilty and may have trouble concentrating.
Now that we've discussed how anxiety or stress may impact you, our next video will discuss things that might help you reduce your vulnerability to stress or anxiety. Specifically, we will examine how seemingly unrelated activities may impact how you feel later on.